everyone. Welcome. We will get started. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Shana Hammerman. I'm the Associate Director of Jewish Studies here at Stanford. And on behalf of Jewish Studies, we welcome you to today's event, Mel Brooks' Disobedient Jew. This event is propelled by the celebrated biography of the same name, written by our esteemed guest, Professor Jeremy Dauber, and it is part of the award-winning series of interpretive biographies called Jewish Lives, published by Yale University Press and edited by Stanford's own Professor Steven Zipperstein. This afternoon, or I guess evening now that the time has changed, is our opportunity to explore the life and works of Mel Brooks, the art of biography writing, and how Mel Brooks' Jewish comedy became synonymous with American comedy in general. Copies of the book will be sold by Stanford's bookstore following the event, which Jeremy has graciously offered to sign. That'll happen in the hallway out there. It is my privilege to introduce our speakers, and I begin with Steven Zipperstein, the director of the Taube Center for Jewish Studies. Steve is the Daniel E. Koshland Professor in Jewish Culture and History at Stanford. He's the author and editor of 9 books, including The Jews of Odessa, A Cultural History, Elusive Prophet, Achad Ha'am and the Origins of Zionism, Imagining Russian Jewry, Memory, History, Identity, and Pogrom, Kishinev and the Tilt of History. He is currently completing his own biography of Philip Roth. In recognition of Steve's many contributions to the field of history, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences just last month. I am now delighted to welcome back to Stanford Jeremy Dauber, who has a few times over the past couple of years participated virtually in conversations about Jews and film through our ongoing retrospective Jewish film series, Rewind. Jeremy is the Atran Professor of Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture at Columbia University, where he's also Emeritus Director of Columbia's Institute of Israel and Jewish Studies. He is the author of several important monographs about Yiddish literature, in addition to American Comics, A History, Jewish Comedy, A Serious History, and of course, Mel Brooks' Disobedient Jew. He's currently working on a history of American horror called American Scary. Steve and Jeremy will be in conversation for about 45 minutes, followed by the opportunity for you to ask questions. Thank you for attending, and please join me in welcoming Steve and Jeremy.
We're going to have a conversation for about 45 minutes, then just open it up, and we're friends and we're accustomed to talking. We've talked a great deal over the years, but never about farts. So I made an incomplete list of the various features according to Jeremy, who's a professor at Augusta University, though 14th on the list this year. I just checked before, not to be pedantic. Painful, bad taste, dangerous, attentive to body functions, farts. How did these become Jewish? Yeah.
Let's start with that, right?
Let's get down to it. Okay.
Let's get right down to the bottom, so to speak, right? Let's get down to the bottom of it. First, before I do, though, I want to thank.
I have more of the bottom to go.
Oh, good. Okay, you never really hit bottom. I think that's the thing here. First, I just want to thank everybody for coming. Steve, I want to thank you not just for this and Shannon, but as you remember, I think you took a very young me to breakfast at one of these conferences 20 years ago, and you really started my academic career. So I just want to I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. So I just want to thank you so much for this. Yeah, give me another round of applause, please do. I'm so grateful to you for everything over the years, and it's great to be here. But now back to farts, which I think is really what everyone came here to. And I think that, one of the things that Jews are attentive to is bodies. And one of we always claim on some level to think of ourselves as the people of the book, the people who think about covenant, all of these things. But at the same time, we're all talking about our gastrointestinal complaints and how much our feet hurt and our backs and all of this, right? And one of the great achievements of Jewish comedy is very frequently to be able to harness those two things together, right? I mean, that wonderful old Jewish joke, you know, about the tailor who like takes a long time to do his work, and the guy comes to pick it up finally after all these weeks, and he says, you know, but God took only 6 days to create the world. And the guy says, well, look at the world, and then look at these pants that I made for you, right? That's sort of Brooks, right, is able to say, I'm going to take the grand expanses of Western myth, and I'm going to harness them to farts. That's really, that in some ways feels very much of that same piece.
Just take apart that one joke. Yeah. It took God 6 days. Why did it take 8 before it picked? What? Well, let me. I want you to sort of explicate as to why that's Jewish, and then maybe do the following. You end your book with a joke, and I want you to make it. I want you to convert it into a Gentile. So
that is beyond my theological purview,
okay,
but I will try and do that
right,
for you. I would try and do anything.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, there have to be limits. Yeah, here it is, the very end of the book. There's a joke that seems to fit here at the end. It's a joke that's said in the shtetl, where a stranger comes to visit the small town, and at the outskirts sees a man sitting in a chair, looking out into the middle distance. What are you doing? The stranger asks, confused. You see, I'm here to watch the graveyard. It's pretty funny.
That's how funny the book is, guys. You should...
Okay. Well,
it's all gold from beginning.
when the Messiah comes and blows his mighty ram's horn, the dead will rise from the graves and come to meet their families before heading to the Holy Land. It's my job to watch for them, and then before they arrive, to run and tell the community that the Messiah has indeed arrived and that redemption is on hand. I see, the stranger said, an important job. How much are you paid for it? 5 kopecks a day. The stranger frowned. That seems like a rather low sum. It is, Watcher said. But you know, it's steady work. Just tell us why that's Jewish,
yeah,
and make it into Goyish.
Yeah. Well,
we're paying him for this.
Yeah. Best review of my book, by the way, I've ever gotten. I think, you know, that one of the things that I think is really wonderful about that joke, and there are a lot of things that are great, but is the fact that that joke could have been told in the shtetl. That is to say, it could have been told. It's a joke that in some sense, on the one hand, relies on a blasphemy against one of the most basic theological beliefs, right? The belief the Messiah could come at any minute, and that's why you're there. But really, it's not going to, right? We know, right? This guy knows. We all know. But at the same time, that joke can exist comfortably within Jewish precincts because there's a kind of loving blasphemy, for lack of a better word, a loving kind of pushback against this. And that kind of thing feels very comfortably Jewish, and I suggest in the biography in some ways, also very comfortably American Jewish as embodied by Mel Brooks, right? You can push against the Western. You can make fun of it, but really you love it, right? That's what a parody is. A parody is about love. I love this so much that I've spent hundreds and thousands of hours watching exactly the genre so that I know it in and out so that I can make fun of it, right? That's what that loving kind of blasphemy is. And that feels to me to be, in a certain way, extremely Jewish in its sort of alienation from itself or from the thing that it loves in some ways.
But there's little love in Don Rickles, is there?
I'm not sure. Well, that's a good question. You know, when he calls someone a hockey puck, you know, one of the interesting things about Rickles is that they love it. He only picks the people who he knows are going to love it. So there is a kind of embodied relationship between the two of them, I think, in some kind of way. Now, all stand-up, I think you're right about this, is this weird combination of aggressiveness and affection. I need love, and I want to push you, right? Brooks, is much more on the needy side of that scale. When he starts out, his routines from a very early age, he has this little patter song, and it literally ends. Like, you couldn't make this up as a biographer. It literally ends with him hand on heart, knee down, saying, "Please love Melvin Brooks." Like, you can't make this up. That's what he wants. So I think that there are different people on this, and Rickles is sort of further towards the more hostile end, but even there's that relationship.
But so how do you pair, at one point in the book, a beautiful book, by the way, you pair Brooks and Philip Roth. Where's the affection in Portnoy's complaint? And many of its contemporaneous critics ask that question rhetorically.
Yeah.
Where do you see them talking to one another, and what do you do about that moment, more or less the same moment, when they really come of age and come to define America?
Yeah. Well, I defer to Roth's biographer on the questions of Philip Roth, but I think one of the things that was interesting to me about, and you correct me if I'm wrong about this, Steve, but that Roth's response to those early critics of Goodbye Columbus, when they said essentially, "You have no love of the Jewish people," right? You have no this sort of vague. I'm oversimplifying, and Steve can correct me, but I'm not interested in. This is where I come from, right? But I'm not interested in kind of, it just happens to be sort of the material that I'm working with, right? And to represent it in this way, that is, in some sense, that's my job. And if that shows warts, that's not my problem, right? That wasn't Brooks's perspective in that same period as you're pointing out at all. Brooks is at that point when Goodbye Columbus comes out, Brooks is coming off, his main thing at that point was having done Your Show of Shows. And one of the points that I make in the book is, Your Show of Shows is not called My Show of Shows or Sid Caesar's Show of Shows. It's yours. Brooks and Caesar and these early people are very aware that they're coming into people's homes. They want to make a connection. They don't want to tear it down, right? And that in some sense, Brooks is, at this point, not in the 1970s, Brooks is still a behind-the-scenes kind of guy. Right. Roth is a man who's interested in putting himself out and making his name at this point.
Well, Brooks is always interested in making his name, no?
He is, but not at this point. He's a little worried about being on camera. Mm-hmm. He's been bad at it. He can't quite do it yet. He's really, what he really wants in 1959, and this is one of the things, as Steve knows better than anybody, about writing biographies, is trying to look at the people in the moments of where they are. And in 59, Brooks is still Sid Caesar's little buddy. Right. He's floundered. He's tried to be a script doctor for shows. He's tried to write television. That's what he wants. He wants to be that guy. He doesn't want to be in front of the camera. And even when he appears in just the next couple of years with Carl Reiner and the 2,000-year-old man, he's mostly a voice. Mostly.
You have this incredibly perceptive section or series of observations about how Jews actually aren't all that prominent before their talkies. Jews have to talk. And you're going to see two Jews who really don't know. No, so,
we're talking
and
right
did
now.
I misread that? And so I just wondered whether you could talk about talking, and then also you describe how so many Jews come to the surface with television, and television specifically, a little bit less so later on, or at least they consolidate themselves. Could you talk about both?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right to put them together, because I think in many ways they really are connected. So, one of the things that really comes about with television, when it starts, television starts really, as I think you all know, as a New York-based institution, and of course it starts as a live institution. And there are people who are looking for this just massive amount of new live material, and they say, where are we going to find a bunch of people who are used to putting on live shows to very demanding audiences in a very regular kind of way? And they said, well, the mountains, that's where we're going to find them. And they went and, and everybody then hired their cousin, right? They hired the people who were good, and then they hired the people who were good's cousins and the people who they knew. And that's how Mel Brooks kind of got started, as Sid Caesar's little buddy as a hanger-on, right? I mean, that's really how he starts. And we don't remember 99% of the people who didn't make it, right? Of course we remember, and there were giants in those days, and among them were Caesar. So that's part of it, and that of course is associated with a kind of talking, but it was a very specific kind of talking. And I think this is important too, because one of the questions that comes out in the late 1950s and the early 1960s is, how Jewish is that voice going to be? Now, television in its early days, we think, certainly people of my cohort who grew up with television think there was no television, and then there was television everywhere, right? Like that, like turning on a TV set. But that's obviously not what happened. Television rolled out slowly over the course of the 50s. And it rolled out mostly in cities first, and then which was a much more cosmopolitan audience. One of the writers in that famous Caesar's writers' room, Big Mel Tolkien, as he was called, Big Mel, as opposed to Little Mel, right, said, as they were writing during the week, he said, Jews, it's Tuesday, and Jews all over the country want to know what we're going to be doing later this weekend, right? I blew that line a little bit, which is why I'm usually not on camera. I think that voice, though, of that explicit Jewishness, if you watch the kinescopes of your show of shows, you don't hear it that much. You don't see it that much. And the reason that 2,000-Year-Old Man, which was being performed at parties for such a long time, didn't go, was people were really worried about it. Reiner and Brooks were worried about it being too Jewish, and also were worried, in a way that so many of Philip Roth's critics were also worried, that this Jewish voice, unfiltered, was going to play into the hands of the anti-Semites.
Yeah, I mean, Roth, what I've come to learn is that Roth zeroed in on those who hated him and didn't actually absorb those who loved him. And I discovered early on in my research for the book, there was this moment in Yeshiva University in 1962, which he says is the quintessential moment where he was humiliated by a Jewish audience. He was excoriated. He compares it to Kafka's trial. And I discovered the tape of the event. It was in the bowels of Yeshiva University. The audience loved him.
Wow,
The audience loved him. They laughed at his jokes. The moderator, David Fleischer, the English teacher then, says out loud 3 times, the audience adores you much more than they like me. But all that Philip remembered, you live with him for long enough, you're on a first-name basis, all that he remembered were all the Jews who ran over to him after he finished his remarks. And this is as Jewish, in my experience, as Passover. The people who dislike you run over, don't do this, run over afterwards and tell you how much they dislike you. That's all he remembered. And so it was, I mean, he wasn't being insincere, but he was being profoundly inexact. You know, he's a novelist, he's not a historian. And, but yeah, so and so that totemic incident actually didn't occur anywhere near the way in which you remembered.
Well, I can't wait to read this, because for those of you, this was and is, I think, in the histories of American Jewish literature, a totemic incident, and we've all, except for Steve, have gotten it wrong, clearly. So I can't wait. This is going to be one of these sort of revelations. I do think that it is, not just a novelistic thing, but it's also a very human thing. Many of us have been in the situations, whether many people here in the academic setting, I guess, of getting a review, and like there's 100 good things, and there's one thing, and it's the one thing we carry around for the rest of our life.
We never carry it around, and we never read it with the shades open, and it's the only review you remember.
Yeah.
And So let's
not dwell on it.
Yeah.
Well, but I think that's this interesting thing, is that you have these nagging and Brooks has them too, right? Of saying, is this going to be too Jew? Is this going to be right? And one of the things that I also point out in the book is that I think we look backwards at Brooks and see sort of this incredible success, but there's a long period of time in which he's in the wilderness. He is not even, he marries Anne Bancroft. At this point, he's not famous. He's not even in the headlines.
We're going to talk about that in a moment, because that I would never fix them up.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we'll come to that later on.
All right, so I'll re-say that sort of later on.
Let me so I was thinking about this conversation last night and decided not to think about it, and took with me to dinner. My wife's out of town, an issue of the London Review of Books, and I open it up, and there's an article about British jokes. Okay, and the author talks about how it's well known that the British are very funny. I taught in Oxford for 6 years. I didn't discover that, but be that as it may. But it made me think about this. What about those poor schlubs who live in countries without many Jews? What do they do for jokes? What do they do?
Well, I think that look, I mean, there is we don't have to spend time on it, right, but there is a great tradition of British kind of from the Pythons, and as I don't need to tell you, but I do think that British comedy, just to take a second on it, is this all the people who were for decades controlled British comedy, they all went to Oxford or Cambridge, and they all were in Footlights or they were in the Oxford Review, and then they all got jobs at the BBC. And they all, and they all like, oh, well, I guess you seem like you have the right college tie. Let's give you 13 episodes. And that became sort of this very top-down sort of class-oriented thing, right? The Jewish comedy comes from being against the grain and is often, I think, propelled by this kind of complicated desire to make it, right, to be part of the system, right, which, depending on who you are, is dedicated with a certain degree of anarchic aggressiveness, if you're the Marx Brothers.
Faulty Towers.
Right. Well, faulty, yeah, sorry.
Isn't that, again, even, one could forgive them for having gone to Oxbridge, but it is shaped against the grain, no? Or do I misread it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that, Faulty Towers is it's a classic British farce. Right, everything starts out well, and then it all sort of collapses, and it's structured like a Swiss watch, which doesn't, which is fine, and is great. But I think that what you don't have there is a kind of destruction of the proprieties. Right, it's like events happen, and your upper class basal fall, your upper or striver, which is a very British type, falls apart. Right, falls apart as a result of the pressure. Right, of trying to keep up appearances, which feels very British to me.
It's a good example of this.
I bet you didn't think Faulty Towers was going to come up, did you?
It's a good example of this that famous Mike Nichols, Elaine May. Do you know about they were in Second City together? And tell me if I'm wrong about this, but it's my understanding that it was this skit that really consolidated more than anything Philip Roth wrote, the stereotype of the Jewish mother. And so you know about the skit. So Mike Nichols is about to blast an American rocket into space, and his mother calls. And he answers the phone. You'll know it much better than me, but and she complains about how he says, well, Mom, I'm blasting a rocket into space, and her response is excuses, and he eventually just falls apart. Could you sort of just explicate that and show us how it's circumcised, if you will?
Well, I think as you say, sort of Nichols and May were just this incalculably influential duo in almost exactly the same period that we're talking about, the very late 1950s, the early 1960s, and they do this kind of these two-handers that are just tremendous, and one of them, this mother and son, as you say, is sort of wowing audiences first on Broadway and then on TV and in the records it's nominated. I can't remember if it wins a Grammy or it's just nominated for one, but it's certainly sort of everybody knows this record. And it comes at exactly that period, the early 1960s, where that Jewish mother stereotype is beginning to coalesce. And so all of these things, it's Nichols and May, it's a number of books that are coming out, it's a couple of different that are coming out at the same time, and it's taking something like The Goldbergs, the show that was first on radio, and sort of twisting it thanks to an increasing sort of period in the late 1950s and 1960s of the psychological trauma and neurosis that parents can put on children, and does it in a very Jewish kind of way, right? And so what it ends up doing is one of my favorite. There are so many good lines from this routine that one can go on, right? She's talking about sort of hypochondria. She says, they had to X-ray my nerves. right? She is, she goes, she's like, I'm so worried because about the rockets. I hear you keep losing them, right? I was just worried it was going to come out of your pay, And as Steve says, like eventually, literally, the skit ends with after like these 7 minutes. It's a 7-minute long skit of just battering psychological damage, one after the other, right? Of him literally goo-gooing and gagaing. He is literally reduced to infantilization as it goes on, right? And this is, of course, what Elaine May's mother, wants all along. Is all she wants is her baby back, right? And that's what she's got in one way or the other. And so there is this wonderful sense in the show, and this gets back to some of the things we've been talking about also with Mel Brooks, right? Of a certain kind of aggressiveness coiled at the heart of this, right? May's character is attacking, right? And Nicholas's character, succumbs. And this is, of course, what Brooks is also trying to do, right? He has a famous line, many of you may know this, of the distinction between comedy and tragedy, right? Tragedy is when I cut my finger, Brooks says, and comedy is when you fall into an open sewer and die. And you can just feel the aggressiveness there, right? I mean, it's pretty nasty, right? So, yeah.
How does this mesh with the rise of all these literary critics? And almost within minutes, a few years after Lionel Trilling squeezes into that position in Columbia. And then you have basically Jews well-known still, to the extent to which anyone who wrote yesterday is still well-known, like Alfred Kazin, and dominating just, the literary space. I mean, how do you see the conversation, if you will, between that happening in literature, in criticism, and in comedy?
That's a great question. I mean, it seems to me, let me try and sort of unpack this a little bit, that one of the things that a lot of these critics, Kazin, Trilling, and others, were to say, this is a shared heritage. The humanities, the Western canon, the humanities, are a shared heritage, a shared liberal heritage that we can all participate in, and we as American Jews are just as entitled, by virtue of our intelligence, to master it and to present it and to speak for it and to be its heirs as anyone else's, right? And so it's their move for equality and sort of equal treatment, sort of within, right? That these are the tools and we can use this in this kind of way. And what I find interesting about your show of shows and Brooks is that they are animated in those first cosmopolitan days of television by a similar hunger, right? They're making fun of Japanese movies and neo-realist Italian cinema. Who watched neo-realist Italian cinema in 1957 in America? A very small number of people, I'll tell you who. The same people. They're going to MoMA and they're watching these and they're making fun of it on your show of shows for millions of Americans. They don't know what it is. They're just, right? So they are a part of this. Big Mel, that Mel Tolkien that I introduces Brooks to the high watermarks of the Western canon and gives him the ambition to be the American Moliere. Who speaks now about being the American Moliere? Mel Brooks did. That's who wanted it, who name checks Aristophanes and Moliere, and who, if you're wondering whether he, tries to cash that check, his movie After the Producers is an adaptation of a Russian Jewish novel, The 12 Chairs, right? One of my takes on this is that in some ways Allen, in certain ways like Nichols and May, are pseudo-intellectuals. And Woody Allen always said that, and no one ever believed him, but it was true. And Mel Brooks was actually an intellectual and became a producer of Brooks films, which produced movies like The Elephant Man and Charing Cross and all these movies. And so I think that there is this kind of ambition and desire that comes out of that same space in a certain way. And everyone agrees that Brooks, in your show of shows, was incredibly interested in, not surprisingly, in those parodies, in those film parodies.
There's a curious timelessness about Brooks. Yeah. Jokes can die quickly with changing cultural norms, making fun of women, for example. Yeah. But you can still watch I'm Tired. Do you know that routine?
From Blazing Saddles.
From Blazing Saddles. It's precious. It's extraordinary, and it doesn't lose its punch. It's comedy. Does that ring true?
I think that does ring true. I mean, there are moments within each of the movies that are dated, right? But overall, the ambition and the project is not. I agree with you. And I think that part of the reason is that what Brooks does is nothing less than take on American myth. And myth in its own ways, the myth of the Western, right? The myth of what scares us, right? Of these big things. And those are, whether timeless, but they last for a very long time. And the ways in which we think about what's lacking in those things, sex, a lot of times, the body.
I was going to turn to that in a moment. But
Yeah,
go on.
right. So I'll speak only abstractly then.
I want just you to talk now about abstract sex.
Yeah, absolutely. So
I'm writing about Roth. Sex belongs to me,
yeah,
buddy.
fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough. Right. But those things those moves of Brooks's, of saying what's not here and let's put it in, those are in those ways timeless, and where we say yes, that's right. Those myths don't talk about it, and that's why we're ever ready to accept those sort of comedic interventions, for lack of.
There's even a kind of postmodernism that you see, that last scene in Blazing Saddles, where he's riding his horse, and he's supposed to be riding his horse, I don't know, to Mount Rushmore or someplace like and then he rides it to the studio. Yeah, I mean.
And I think that's right. And let's just take that. So if you haven't seen the movie in a long time, right? This idea that basically everything we've been watching takes place on a Hollywood soundstage, right? And there's a big fight that goes through. It goes through like a big Busby Berkeley kind of like dance number, all these kind of things. And I want to say one of the interesting things, and I talk about this briefly in the book, right, is that as we all know, failure is an orphan, success has 1,000 parents, right? Everyone always wants to take credit for successes. Blazing Saddles, enormous hit. Everyone agrees that ending is Brooks and Brooks alone, right? Blazing Saddles has multiple writers. Everyone says that ending that sort of calls attention, and this is another of those myth interventions, it's all made up. It's all artifice, right? All we're doing is putting on a show. That's one of the greatest interventions in myth, that it is itself a myth, right? That was Brooks. None of the other writers ever sort of objected to that characterization. And that's also always been a Brooks thing, is sort of saying, this is all made up, it's all BS.
So there's appreciably more reference to sex in my Philip Roth biography than in your Mel Brooks biography. You deal with their meeting, their maybe dating, their moving in together in a paragraph or two. This is an unlikely coupling. Do you agree? I mean, you say she finds him funny. He's convinced he's profoundly funny looking. She's a beauty queen. Yeah. Can you just fill in some of, I mean, not all the details, and biography is an intrusive genre, and I'm not trying to intrude, but just give us a little bit more. Something Zaftig.
Something Zaftig. First, this gets back to the sentence that we teased earlier, right? The idea that Mel Brooks does not appear in his own wedding announcement. Okay, it says Anne Bancroft weds comedy writer. Okay. At this point, that's how unfamous he is when they get married, right? He doesn't even rate his own name in the announcement. In terms of what you're saying of that sort of that moment of self-evaluation, right? Think about it in that way too. Like, what is he doing with her? And lots of people.
What is she doing with him?
I'm sorry. Yes. What is she doing with him? Thank you. Yes. What is she doing with him? That was very much part of this story for the two of them. And I think that ultimately it was one of the reasons why for a very, very long time they didn't work together. Certainly not until he became, very famous. Because there were these sort of ego issues involved. But I think that one of the things that to me was the most interesting, and I'm not sure whether this counts as Zaftig or not, but at least it does bring in another celebrity relationship, so at least I'll count that, is that it gets to the very heart of Mel Brooks' theology. So the question was, of course, Anne Bancroft, not Jewish, right, and did not convert to Judaism. And Brooks's line about this was always, she doesn't have to convert because she's a star. That was his line. And one of the points that I make in the book is that just a couple of years before they get married, Elizabeth Taylor, right, an incalculably bigger star at the time than Anne Bancroft, yeah, no question, most famous female star in the world, converts to Judaism to marry Eddie Fisher, right? So, there was precedent, is my point. But ultimately, what Brooks wanted, and part of this you could say psychobiography, he had, he was looking for a father, he had lost his father when he was very young, whatever, he always needed love. And the idea that this wattage, this star wattage, had somehow managed to find him attractive, however that attraction is defined, and really so, was just everything to him. Everything. And, he had a first marriage. That first marriage did not go very well. A lot of this was his fault. He had all sorts of affairs, including with Eartha Kitt. There's your little details. But
we're trying to tease this out.
Yeah, exactly. We're trying to get, But by all accounts that I have seen, heard, read, his marriage to Anne Bancroft was an extremely happy one. Yes, I would say that, an extremely happy one, and just grew and grew for decades. And really, her death of cancer in 2005, that really, with very few exceptions, put the end to his career. It really, it was just a massive.
The only time I remember them together on the screen, I can't remember, was when he did this show, I think it was part of Larry David.
Yes.
Yeah. You want to talk about that for a
Sure.
moment? And yeah.
And so they had starred together in a remake, the only remake really that Brooks ever did, which was To Be or Not to Be, sort of. And the movie's not that great, but they're wonderful together. They're actually, this wonderful moment. It's this sort of elegiac moment, is in this season-long arc of Curb Your Enthusiasm, which some of you may have seen, in which Larry David is cast as Max Bialystock in a L.A. company version of The Producers. And for those of you who have ever seen Curb Your Enthusiasm, you will not be surprised to find that Larry David screws it up. Or at least for most of the season, he screws it up. And I will not ruin every aspect of why this extremely odd thing happens. But suffice it to say that Mel Brooks and Anne Bancroft together appear in this, and they are behind it. And it allows them, and Brooks was always grateful to David for allowing them to appear together and to have this last moment together on screen. It came out, I think, 2 years before she died, but she already had cancer, the cancer that would kill her. And it really is sort of a lovely moment of seeing the two of them together.
This gets to something I've wanted to get to for the last 40 minutes.
Okay.
So you have this minority in America that is bent in the same way that Asians are in more recent times to achieve success, and who do achieve success in America for all kinds of socioeconomic, cultural reasons, and produce artifacts, literary artifacts, Malibut, etc., comedy. I Spy is Jewish, you say. James Bond, who doesn't soil his shoes, is not Jewish. Produce all these artifacts about failure. Yeah. So the striving for success and these artifacts that are Jewish because they're built around failure. You're a professor at Columbia. Help us understand that, Professor.
Well, I mean, no, I think that, go on.
It's a tough one.
No, it is a tough one. But I think that ultimately, certainly comedy, and we can speak about some of the others too, but comedy is very much based, almost even the most successful comedy, of an askew view of the world. It's someone who is able to sort of stand out of the world and say, this is not exactly right for some reason. And what that almost always demands is someone who in one way or another is a failure to be congruent with the world, right? There's someone who hasn't really been able to fit in properly. And that's why they have that position. And very frequently, not always, but very frequently, American Jews, particularly American Jewish creative, have found themselves to be structurally in that position of being alienated and outside, right? This is particularly true at certain moments rather than others, but in some, right? And they can deal with that in a number of different ways. One of my other areas that, as Shana mentioned earlier, is writing about comic books. And you had a lot of American Jews who said, we would love to be comic strip artists. We'd love to be syndicated in hundreds of newspapers and make millions of dollars, as some of these people literally did. But we can't because it's closed to Jews. And so instead, we're going to make these sort of crap medium comic books. And you know what we're going to do? We're going to dream of being people like Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent. That's our dream, right? That's one way of doing it, is to create a kind of vision of the world of pure congruent success. And even that has its cracks and traces, where Lois Lane doesn't really like Clark Kent, right? She likes Superman. Right? Bruce Wayne is, let's put it mildly, psycho, right? So you have those, right? But with comedy, it's much easier because failure, can be tragic and can be terrible, and people like Malibu can play it and other writers can do it in a number of ways. But it can also be, as Malibu can do too, very funny, right? Sometimes it's funny because the failures, the people who are failures, don't know, right? They keep trying and they're deluded, and the irony comes on the level of the novel. And sometimes it's funny because they do know, but they keep trying, which is the definition of insanity. But that works perfectly well if you're the Roadrunner, right, or something like that, right? You can know, and you just keep trying anyway. So, Brooks' parodies are very much structured around the idea of, I'm in the system, but I'm not really in the system, but I'm also in the system. I'm a disobedient Jew, but I'm your disobedient Jew, which is how he signed his letters. You're a disobedient Jew, Mel Brooks. But I'm disobedient.
So one final question before we open up, and then maybe I'll tell just a very quick Ostjüdische story. We're living in a moment now, however one understands it, and we don't need to talk about it now because some of us have been talking about little else, where Jews are inordinately prominent. Are there moments, as you see it, where certain jokes that might have been told maybe 7 weeks ago just might not be told now? There's a line in The Counterlife, one of Roth's novels, where one of the characters, an Aunt Essie, at a funeral says, I give money to Israel. Why? Because that's where you hear the best anti-Semitic jokes. Are there lines that might, until very recently, been crossed with pleasure that one might not cross now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think, yes. I mean, comedy is always about timing, right? That's the essential truth of comedy. It's always about timing. And when I teach about Mel Brooks to my students at Columbia, I sometimes say, I talk about the whole sort of gamut of his work sometimes and things like that, and I say, when Mel Brooks did the musical version of The Producers on Broadway in the early 21st century, it was lavishly received, as all of you know. It won all the Tonys and it made all the, right? And my question to the students is, even before a couple of weeks ago, post 2016, post Charlottesville, post all, would you do a revival of The Producers now? And how would it have to be thought about? And I think most of my students agree that whatever the answer to that is, and people could have a variety of answers, we would have to think about it differently after 2016 than we thought about it in 2003, right? Timing matters. Timing changes. And one of the things about comedians, now not just comedy, right, is that they are always on the front lines. They're always on the front lines of saying, can this joke be told now? Can it, is it too soon? Is it too late? Is it right? Is this the right, And those things change all the time. And that's one of the most interesting things to me about comedy, is that it really can be a finger on the pulse of where a culture is at a very particular moment. And as you say, that can change in a flash.
The Hebrew word is a chush, this sort of sense that Brooks had. I remember watching him in some conversation where he was talking about someone jumping out of a window. And he said, I can't remember the exact numbers, he said, 57th floor, that's not funny. 36th floor, that's funny. Now, why? I don't know. But let me end with this. And I've never told this story in public in all my years at Stanford, but I just thought this might be an appropriate time. It'll be brief, and then we'll open up for discussion. So, many years ago, I was taking I started in Russian history and then added Jewish history and took 2 sets of PhD exams. And when I was taking my Russian language exam, my Russian history professor was the most Germanic person I'd ever met. And really, I mean, it turned out to be a German Jew. I knew Hungarians growing up, Budapest Hungarians, who tried to act German, but this was a German, and I was terrified of him. And so I was given 3 or 4 pages of Russian to translate, and he said, do the translation and come over to my house. And he then lived in the flats in Beverly Hills. It was at UCLA, and it's dusk. I get out of my car and step into very fresh dog poo. And I'm walking furiously along the grass in Beverly Hills. I had to be in Beverly Hills, trying to get rid of the potential stench. And I knock on Hans's door. He was not Hans then, he was Professor Roger, and he's in a robe. And he says, I've come down with a cold. Why don't we look at your text in my study? So I hadn't been to his house before, and this is the first time I noticed that the entire house was carpeted in off-white carpets.
Oh, no.
And so I'm holding the fate of my life in my hands, walking on the carpet with my head down, just trying to see if I was leaving any Ostjüdische imprints. And then he says, the warmest room in the house is my study, which is small. Let me look at the text there. So there's the same off-white carpet. The room is warm. I'm trying to smell as vigorously as I possibly can without being noticed. The story basically ends there, and I lived to tell it. But it was like as I was reading the book and rereading the book and having reread the book a number of times in various alliterations, I couldn't help thinking about that. Now that's a Jewish joke, right?
Yeah, I think that.
And it involves excrement.
It does. It does. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I couldn't help it.
No, that's fantastic. Yeah, no, that's great. And you can just, I can imagine the movie that came to me while you were talking is the movie There's Something About Mary, right? Where you just have like this scene where the tension, right, the vulgarity ratchets up and up and up and up, and it feels right very Jewish, So,
and he gets the girl.
He does get the girl. Right?
Yeah. And she's blonde. Okay. Anything come to mind?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So, looking around here and hearing you talk, I realize that this is an older demographic, right?
With the exception of us.
Right. But my kids and my grandkids don't have that same feel for the Jewishness in all of these jokes, and I'm wondering where it's going to go. Is there going to be a generation of funny comedians that my kids and grandkids can relate to?
It's a great question. I mean, I think that it's never going to happen again for institutional and structural reasons that that American comedy is Jewish comedy in the way that it was between sort of the mid 50s and the mid 80s, let's say. the country has gotten bigger. The avenues to getting into the entertainment business has gotten bigger. The channels have all gotten smaller and more narrowed and more niche. So that the structural and institutional are just not going to have it happening again. That said, there are opportunities because of all of those things to have certain kinds of Jewish comedy that you could have never had before, right? And that can be a wide variety of things. So, for example, your children, maybe your grandchildren, I don't know the ages, of course, but they might have enjoyed Broad City, which was this very Jewish comedy about these two young women, very vulgar. In some ways,
We'll give you a list.
yeah, we'll give you a list. Right? There'll be a homework. They'll be reading. There's Orthodox Jewish comedy that you can now watch on YouTube if you chose to. There's TikTok comedy, for God's sake, right? So it's not to say that your grandchildren's algorithmic choices might lead to those things, but they could. And they could have a variety and diversity of Jewish comedic experience that those of us who grew up with just a couple of channels of television and watching shows really wouldn't have been able to have.
I mean, if you think about it, I mean, Shiva Baby, that movie.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to give your grandchildren a list of dirty movies. And Sarah Silverman, Rachel Bloom, all permeated with Jewishness, all many ways in conversation with Brooks and his generation, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, it's a great list, and Bloom is a great parodist, and a musical fan, right? A fan of turning some of those parodies into music.
You just come to Stanford and we'll give you a list of filthy movies, okay?
There you go.
All right.
Let's going to lose some of its universality.
And I think that is a fair concern, but one of the things that I'm finding very interesting is that almost everything is. We're in an atmosphere now where there's very little that speaks for everything anymore in the same way, and I think that's just where the structures of entertainment have gone. Things that would have, the audiences that a Sid Caesar or a Mel Brooks movie would have, they just don't draw those kinds of things anymore because everyone's on their own screens watching their own curated stuff. And that it's just a different world that we're in now, but at least it's a world that allows for even more idiosyncratic and particular things to flourish in these smaller gardens if people choose to discover them.
Yeah, but doesn't, I mean, apropos of that, the evolution from Seinfeld to Rachel Bloom is one consistent with what you're describing, that ethnicity just permeates Rachel Bloom, and everyone knows that George is Jewish, even though he's Catholic, but he's Jewish. And but somehow to normalize him, he sort of had to be a goy.
I think that's right. I mean, Seinfeld is, of course, is a network show. It's always it begins and ends as a network show. Curb Your Enthusiasm, that next intermediate stage, starts out on something which at the time was advertised as it's not TV, it's HBO, right? Something that you could have. And then Rachel Bloom gets her start on YouTube. Right, she then goes to television. She goes to the CW, but she starts as a YouTube person where anyone can upload anything, and she does. And one of the amazing things is that some of these things, anyone can upload something, and then if it gets, as Bloom did, hundreds of thousands or millions of views on YouTube, then sort of larger channels of entertainment are going to come calling, which is what happened. So there is this kind of possibility to find an audience for material in a way that wasn't there before.
It seems to me that there always is a revival of interest. So even the students who study things that are Jewish or Yiddish, they're always going to come back to it in their studies, if not in pop media.
And I think that's right. And I think that one of the things that I find, a colleague of mine in my department and I are thinking about teaching a class on Netflix next year. And part of the reason is because the algorithm, I keep saying the word algorithm, but the decisions by these programmers to put some things in and see what's popular are just amazingly, if you had said to, I think, any of us 10, 12 years ago, there's going to be a show on something called streaming, right, which features a lot of Yiddish materials and is mostly in Yiddish and in Hebrew, and millions of people are going to watch this show called Shtisel, right? Jewish, not no. What are you talking about? Like that's never going to happen, right? And someone made a decision to put that on, and now, and so those kind of decision processes can supercharge this. Back to Seinfeld, there was one of these great moments in the show within a show of Seinfeld where some of you may remember this, George and Jerry get picked up for a show by NBC, and George is very insistent that it's a show about nothing, right? And so the NBC exec says, well, why is anyone going to watch a show about nothing? And George says, because it's on. And Bob Balaban, who was the exec, is like, not yet. But the answer is also like, why are people watching this show? And part of it is because it appears on the home screen. And they're like, oh, let's give it a try. And I'm very interested to find out how all of those interactions play with each other. I think that's an interesting sort of question.
But I'm also wondering if your question has to do with the current events, because a lot of the young people are, I don't know, maybe feeling shame or arrogant.
We haven't noticed that. we noticed.
That wasn't what I was getting at.
Do you want to build on that observation? Do you want to build on? Yeah.
I don't know how that will have to go with humor. I mean, with their interest in their Judaism or things that are Yiddish or comedy or entertainment. We'll just have to see.
I agree with that. It's going to be very interesting to look back a year from now and see what happens. We're in the middle of it now. It's hard to tell.
Can you explain, just moving away from comedy for a second, how it is that, say, Rachel Maddow uses words like shtick, or Anderson Cooper, who I'm convinced is Gentile, and how this terminology has come, because I mean, Jeremy really started as a exceptionally talented student of Jewish literature. He wasn't always doing this Narishkeit. And I mean, how did these Yiddish terms become sort of normalized, where they can just use them without translation, and irrespective of their ethnic background, and assume audiences of millions know what they, well, I mean, it's CNN, so they aspire to audiences of millions. It's more or less the people in this room. But how does this happen?
So I have a 2-word answer and a 6-word answer. Okay. My 2-word answer is Mad Magazine. And my 6-word answer is Mad Magazine and other stuff like it. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that popular culture of the 1950s and the 1960s injects a tremendous amount of Yiddish and Yiddish-sounding stuff. Mostly not comedy, but in a comedic kind of event, right, for a comedic purpose, right? And that snowballs. So people have this sort of, increasingly by the 1970s or so, we have these books, these popular books of sort of collection. I mean, not just the Joys of Yiddish, but a lot of other collections like that of books with sort of Yiddish words in them. And so there's a whole swath of them that become kind of normalized, thanks to that boomer generation, basically, as kids. Not that Anderson Cooper, Rachel Maddow are boomers, but they are able to the boomers are able to work it into their regular vocabulary, or sort of certainly not find it particularly alien, and then it just picks up.
Did you just building on that question before, but in terms of your own intellectual evolution, when we first met, and you were writing about canonized texts, and now, with some frequency, you write about farts, and extremely well. I mean, were you worried about that? I mean, were you self-conscious about that sort of unpredictable trajectory in your own intellectual life?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, so there's an old, we're talking about Mel Brooks, so I'm going to be vulgar for 1 second, if that's all right.
We've been waiting for this.
You've been waiting for this.
Yeah.
So okay. So, but it's not. So I think it was Charles Beaumont, who was a famous sort of science fiction and Hollywood screenwriter, magazine writer of the mid 20th century, who said that success in Hollywood is like climbing a mountain of cow shit in search of a perfect rose. Actually, this is apropos for your story, right? And the tragedy of success in Hollywood is that by the time you get to the top of the mountain, you've lost your sense of smell. And one of the things that I thought was that I was always interested in a wide variety of things, and mostly what it turned out that I was interested in, and since you were the one who published my first book, you know this, is the way that people react to things. So my first book, because I know all of you read Antonio's Devils, Writers of the Jewish Enlightenment and the Birth of Early Modern Hebrew and Yiddish Literature, was the way that rabbinic allusions, or jokes, were used by a bunch of 18th and 19th century writers, and how people did or didn't receive them. And really in my work on comedy and on horror, and that's really what I'm interested in, is the way that people write stuff and the way that people think about them. And it's all of a piece. It's just now what I'm interested in more is thinking about that in an American landscape, and to really get to sort of larger canvases, and also from a technical perspective. The thing about Maskilic material, or even early modern supernatural stuff, which was the subject of my second book, is that it's very hard to tell whether or not something worked, right? But if you have a stand-up routine and nobody laughs, or if you make a horror movie and nobody walks out scared in any way, you probably have done a bad job. And so it's very interesting to me to kind of track that and see from both a technical perspective and a way of like what bothers the culture.
Yeah, I think it's pretty free. It's often, and I think this is true, no less true for scholars than artists. You end up circling, even if it's not obvious that you're doing this, around a very discrete set of issues.
Yeah.
And I think in many ways the difference between a neurotic and an artist or a scholar is what you do with it. But oftentimes I think if one is at all self-aware, one becomes aware that as disparate as your books or your artistic work might be, there is this cluster, this very discrete cluster that you're circling around.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's 100% right. I mean, to me, it's also been interesting to see, like, what are the questions that I'm not interested in, like you're saying. Like, so I have never been particularly not, or I should rephrase it, I've always been a plot guy. I'm a narrative guy. That's what I'm interested in. So it's not surprising to me that a lot of the literature that is less interested in plot or narrative, I'm less interested in. And so when you write histories, big histories of things, it becomes, you see what's easier and harder for you to write about, because you just say, well, okay, you owe it to the book to write about modernist literature if it's covered by some subject, but it's not your thing. So like that's become very, it's very clarifying in the negative space too, as well as the positive space.
Hi, thank you so much. I had a question about when you were talking about like how Jewish can your voice be and talking on the radio. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that in terms of, is it, like a literal voice, what you say, how you express things, just
Absolutely. I'd be happy to, and of course, Steve, you have much to say about this too. So it was, one of the things that I found really interesting, I was not necessarily expecting, was about the sort of the birth of the 2,000-year-old man, which is where that part of the conversation was. And I had always heard that it was just because it was like, oh, it would be too Jewish, it wouldn't succeed, right? It was just too Jewish for the American audiences, and that's why they didn't put it to record for quite a long period of time. But I was reading, in the course of the book, I was reading Carl Reiner's memoir, and he says that there was another reason too. It was partially that, but it wasn't only that. And it was that after the Holocaust, they became very concerned that Jewish dialect comedy, and they viewed the 2,000-year-old man in part, not only, but in part as Jewish dialect comedy, using that very Jewish dialect voice, right, that Mel Brooks kind of uses, was giving aid and comfort to anti-Semitism. And there's an article by a guy named Sam Levinson, who was a very famous comedian of the time. I think it was in Commentary, maybe they're saying the Jewish dialect comedian should vanish. That was around this time. And they said, we just can't do this when they started in the early to mid 50s. As time went on, anti-Semitism rates dropped in the United States. A lot of other people were doing Jewish voices. It was becoming sort of more comfortable. And so, they've become part of a trend as well. But that was, I think, very much part of their reticence to do it, was saying, what are people going to think? And it's funny because, also Brooks becomes, as he becomes more successful, it becomes a virtuous cycle of uncaring. I don't care what people think. It's easy to say that when you're Mel Brooks in 1975 and you've just had, it's harder to say it in 1960 when you've had all these flops. And so, you can hear all the little voices in your head, and this was one of them.
What wasn't he good at, Mel Brooks? Where were his sort of, what was his Achilles heel?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think as a writer, the answer is structure. If you read a lot of the critics of his early stuff, the stuff that fails, and you can even see this in the massive successes, people say there's not a lot, really, that the structure is either just kind of there to hang gags on, right? And the gags are magnificent, but the story is kind of weak, or it's not there at all, right? And some of the real failures, sort of in his early days, particularly. And you could say that's not a problem. Okay, you don't have to go to a Mel Brooks movie for the plot. I think it's not a coincidence that his most tightly structured movie, in my opinion, Young Frankenstein, is written really with Gene Wilder. Gene Wilder is really kind of the hand behind this. He comes with the story. But Brooks was always, and it turned out, he was a spritzer. He was a talking writer. He would always have people he would put out, genius a million miles a minute, and he would have someone shape it in. In A 2,000-Year-Old Man, that's Carl Reiner. Brooks is going to go off in 5 million different directions. That's his genius. And it was Reiner's genius to say, okay, let's bring this back. Let's move it forward. And so that was, and that's why he loved working with partners. I mean, Reiner first among equals, but Gene Wilder and other people in different sort of writing aspects.
And Gene Wilder, just his persona is diametrically different from Mel Brooks, isn't it? Or is it? Do I misunderstand?
Well, no, I think it's one of the things that Brooks always said about the producers. It's a great question. What Brooks said was that he was like, everyone thinks I'm Bialystok, but that's not right. I'm Bialystok and Bloom, right? And I think that makes sense, right? Bloom, he said he called him Bloom because he wanted the sound of a weedy little weed opening up into a flower, right? And in some ways, that's what Brooks is doing on the producers. He's saying can I do this, right? And he has this other part of him saying, do it, do it, do it, right? And that's the Zero Mostel part. So, but if you see kind of in the producers and in a different kind of way in Young Frankenstein, once that part of Wilder gets going, it's explosive, right? My favorite scene in the producers is, it's a famous one, but it's not the kick line, it's not all this, but where Mostel is tormenting Wilder. You may remember this. He realizes that Wilder has a little bit of his baby blanket that he carries around. And he takes it from Wilder, and Wilder just goes bananas, and you see Mostel being like, oh my, both Mostel and Bialystok, because it's both of them, but like, this guy is much crazier than I ever thought he could be, right? And Mostel has said that when he saw Wilder sort of perform, he had to up his game. He thought he was going to be able to walk all over the right. And you see this in Young Frankenstein too. You just see it in the hair, as he just goes like crazier. So I think that's in some ways, Brooks starts out as a kind of suit and tie man behind this. I mean, he's always crazy. He's always a spritzer. And just gets literally wilder and wilder, right, as it goes on.
The new book you're working on is horror movies?
Not, basically what scared the crap out of Americans from the beginnings to now.
So, I was struck by your Mel Brooks's observation that there was no filmmaker that intrigued him more than Hitchcock. That wedding of comedy and horror, you see in Brooks too, don't you?
Yeah, I think that's 100% right. I mean, Brooks is very attracted to horror from an early age, right? I mean, he is really almost coterminous with the sound movie, his life. Right, and he sees Frankenstein at 6 or something like that, and has these nightmares about him. But very early, he learns how to cope with the horror by turning it into kind of comedy. From a very early age, he and his friends used to sort of crack each other up by doing an imitation of Frankenstein doing the number putting on the Ritz, which of course he repurposes much more famously many decades later in the movie. And you have this sense that that is, in its own way, something that Hitchcock can do too, although Hitchcock's sense of humor is much more ironic than Brooks's is. It's much more restrained and controlled. But that makes sense because he's a much more restrained and controlled filmmaker than Brooks was.
Might we expect in the immediate future a different kind of horror movie, given, and excuse me, I don't want to politicize this, but given, the very real possibility that Frankenstein could be elected president, for example, and so the Earth is burning, though the most burning question on the college agenda is no longer global warming, but something appreciably different. There's we're surrounded. I was too young to really take in the fear of nuclear war when, the communist menace was transformed into horror movies, of course, the Body Snatchers. Yeah. But can we expect a different texture to horror movies? Could you imagine? I know you're writing about the history of it and not the future of horror, but there is a future to horror, and we're arguably right in the middle of it right at this moment.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's really interesting about looking at 300 plus years of this, not just movies obviously, but 300 plus years of this, is that, everything goes through, I don't want to say cycles implying sort of a particular periodicity of it, right? That's not what I mean. But it goes through cycles. And so we have, as you're pointing out, we have periods of a more apocalyptic sensibility, and we have periods of a less apocalyptic sensibility. And the movies and the works very frequently, although you don't want to be monolithic about it, but reflect this. So like there are periods where you say, everything is falling apart. All the institutions are falling apart. And the movies that come out within a couple of years really reflect that. A period that I'm thinking about a lot now is the period of the early to mid 1970s, in which, post sort of a tremendous amount of countercultural, of saying, the planet is burning, right? We have a madman who's president, right? We have
These are prophetic movies.
But you have a whole series of movies about, how would I put this, sort of a combination of corrupted and parodied versions of institutions. So you have movies like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Hills Have Eyes, which are these sort of corrupted versions of the American family and sort of the home and hearth kind of things. And you have paranoid movies like 3 Days with a Condor and The Parallax View, which I also think are movies about fear, not horror movies in the narrow generic sense, but movies about fear. As you say, at that point, we're not really worried about nuclear stuff in the same way. That comes back in the 1980s during sort of the hot Cold War period. And then you have movies where, again, whether it's War Games or Red Dawn or things like that, you have these movies that come out. So absolutely, it's gonna, it already is happening, but it's gonna happen again. But as you say, predictions are hard, especially about the future, and I tend to predict the past much better. So it's
What movies frighten you?
Well, I think, it's funny. The things that are the scariest to me, Steve and I were talking about, Steve has grandchildren, I have children, and one of the things, I was talking about reactions to things and how I'm interested in them. And some of you or many of you may have had this with your own children or your own grandchildren if you have them, where before I had children, I was like, I can't believe they put a kid in danger. What a stupid and cheap melodramatic move. And now that I have kids, I'm like, oh my God, this is the worst thing ever, right? And I'm the same person, except that I'm not, but I kind of am, right? And that process sort of changed. So the things that, as I've grown and I've become much less narcissistic as I have family that I care about, is the ones in which there is real violence, psychological or otherwise, done between people. the monster movies are not nearly as scary to me as the ones of psychological distress.
I feel the same way.
Yeah, and that's been a change for me. I mean, when I was a kid, I was like, oh, slashers, but now not as much anymore. It's these that are.
Any final questions? All right, the light. Yes, just please.
I was wondering how you thought Borat fit into this.
How does Borat fit into this? I just want to make sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, Borat is a genius. Or I should say, Sacha Baron Cohen, who plays Borat, of course, is a genius. And what I think, I'm going to connect this to the last question, if I may. Right. One of the things that is fantastic about Sacha Baron Cohen's performances is that what he attempts to do, and I mean this in two different ways, but is to try and reveal certain kinds of hidden truths, right, in the purpose of these interviewers, right, and to say that, right. So one of the famous ones, and this shows both the truth and the truth in quotes, right, is the infamous "throw the Jew down the well" skit. Right, where he goes to a country, some of you may know this, where he goes to a country western, where he pretends to be this Kazakhstani reporter, and he gets everybody to start singing along with a country and western song from his own country. And the chorus is about "throw the Jew down the well." And like you have all these country and western people like clapping along and singing along about this thing. Right, and one of the interesting things is that it's not as clear as there's one way of reading the scene and being like, oh, I guess this shows what really is underneath. And there's a way of showing this, of saying, what are the ways that people go along with certain kinds of things. There's another scene where there's a kind of martial arts movement. This is in one of the Borat movies. And he goes to a martial arts studio and he says, I'm laughing because my brother and I love to joke about this. He says, well, how would you do a kick, and then how would you do a strike, and how would you defend against a Jew claw, right? And he kind of keeps lunging at this guy, and the guy is pretty much, you can tell, the guy is not going along with this, but he wants to be polite with this Kazakhstani reporter. And and a lot of these things, they're supposed to show how terrible people are, but what they actually end up showing is that people are much nicer in the face of aggrandizement and insanity than you would think that they would be.
With the exception of Giuliani.
With the exception of Giuliani, yes. In the last movie, yes, 100%. In the Borat
Yeah,
sequel,
he can't redeem.
That's
He can't redeem Giuliani.
That's indefensible. That is indefensible. 100%. So yeah.
All right. Once you mentioned Giuliani, what more is there to say? Right. Yes, there's more to say.
Just a little. So first of all, of course, thanks for coming, and I'm sure you were scheduled quite a while back, but to come and discuss the great comic Mel Brooks during our tragic Jewish moment. Thank you. Thank you. So a couple of things. Then it's hard to keep it all together without a note and paper and everything, but that joke in the beginning about Mashiach is also how Fiddler on the Roof ends. They say, we'll have to wait for him somewhere else. So that kind of remembered that one. And then, I was thinking, you were using the word myth, but I would put forth that Mel Brooks really he invented his own genre, his parody of his own Jewish parody movie of the great American myths,
Yeah.
of that American films were monster movies, Western movies, movies about showbiz. So his own genre, and oh boy, I'm trying to remember my thoughts. Also, TV. Speaking of the voices coming out of radio, and I couldn't help thinking about the other great genre of Mickey Katz, and the parody. Mickey Katz using the American mythology and putting his Jewish characters and themes and stuff. And Mel Brooks, it seems to me, just came right out of that, but he did it in film.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, with Mickey Katz, right? This was one of those things that I was alluding to, although I didn't mention him. You're 100% right about sort of hearing the Jewish voice, right, and this sort of Judaizing, right? And one of the interesting things is that Katz, who would say, for example, instead of the song of Davy Crockett, he was like David Crockett, right? Who was on Delancey Street and things like that, right? You would have a much more explicit Jewish stuff that even Brooks, in some ways, would. So I think you're right about that. I mean, I think in terms of the, which allowed Brooks to have a bigger success in some ways than Katz himself even did, although he was quite successful. I think in terms of the myth question, I think you're right that he creates sort of this thing. And one of the things that becomes interesting is that you can track in a certain way the beginning of Brooks's artistic decline, not totally, but beginning of when he begins to say, these are genres that I'm not myself interested in, but I know that I have to kind of do them because they're what's hot now. So he says this about Spaceballs, for example, that he says, that my kids love Star Wars, and but I'm not so into it. And that begins, there is a way in which, how would I put this, that I think about this a lot, that entertainers only get a certain amount of time, right? They only get a certain amount of time to sort of control the public conversation and to be very much in the public conversation. And it's interesting to see how there's almost no one who is a exception to the 10-year rule of this. But Brooks had his hands around this for about 20 to 30 years, and thank God he did. I'm really happy about that too. So good on him, So.
Let me end with this. I don't know if you'll agree, but it seems to me one of the least funny books about jokes was written by Sigmund Freud. Yep. And he defines humor with the following sentence. He says the purpose and function of jokes consists from the first in lifting internal inhibitions and in making sources of pleasure fertile, which have been rendered inaccessible by those inhibitions. So we begin with farts and we end close to farts, it seems to me, when I think about Freud's sentence. Does the sentence make sense? Maybe one of the few sentences in that book that continues to resonate?
Yeah, one of the things that I always think about comedy.
I've never actually, I don't think in all my years at Stanford I've ever actually talked about farts as much in a public setting.
I would kind of hope not.
But, no. This is what we do at Stanford. Yeah.
That's right. It's all farts all the time, except for you. No, I think one of the things that I love about comedy is how resistant it is to theorizing. Everyone tries to theorize about it. And my wife finds me extremely annoying. I mean, she loves me, but she also finds me extremely annoying because anytime she wants to make.
Talk about that?
I'm just gonna put my feet up. I hope you're charged. Yeah. But is because I always want to give sort of specific cases. I don't want to make a particular sort of grand theory. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm attracted to comedy is that it's this alchemical magic that comes. So we can talk about sort of all of these different kinds of genre and the myth and all that, but ultimately what Brooks doesn't do is anything to please us as academics, right? Or critics. He does it to please us as watchers, as people, as audiences. And he'll put everything together in order to do that, including fart prodigiously. And again, how can we not be grateful for those gifts that he's given us? Take that, Freud. I guess that's what I would say.
So I was really, really looking forward to this session, and I think it justified my expectation. Especially at a moment like this, to be in a public setting where no one mentioned colonialism, and although I mean you're encouraged to do so now if you want, but yeah, so I just the prospect of actually just talking about what we talked about for the last hour and a half, and with someone like you, who's a pleasure to talk with, was just wonderful. I want to thank all of you here. I want to
Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.
That's all, folks.
That's a wrap. Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.